It's become increasingly apparent that there is a horrible double standard of justice in this country. When my own case went up before the court, I thought that this was a double standard that applied perhaps to high visibility political pundits, later to high visibility political figures like President Trump. But now it's very clear that this built-in inequity, if you will, this is the real inequity in American justice, is permeating out into society more generally. And we see it right before our eyes if we only will have eyes to see. We're seeing riots as we speak, riots going on in Minnesota and many other cities. And you see people fighting with cops, hitting cops, jumping on police cars. And what happens to those people? Well, what happens to them by and large is they get caught, they get arrested, they are released immediately, very often without bail, and then promptly they have their charges either significantly modified or dropped completely. So this is a sort of catch and release, no big deal. And why? Well, you know, they're fighting against social injustice. They're fighting because they believe that our justice system is wrong. Now, let's compare this to the January 6th protesters. Every day I see on social media, the FBI puts up photos. They're trying to catch this old man. They're trying to catch this little girl who has a cap over her eyes. Can you find her? Will you report her? So these are people who are being treated completely differently. No catch and release. In fact, when they are caught, the federal prosecutors go to judges and say, let's just leave him locked up. And in some cases locked up in solitary confinement. And they're facing the most serious charges that carry years and years and years in prison. Now, of course, the left's pretext for this double standard is, well, Dinesh, there's an obvious difference. In one case, you have people who are fighting for social justice, and in the other case, you have people who believed a lie. Wait a minute. Political protest is not contingent upon whether or not you agree with what the protest is about. Just as the people on one side firmly believe that our system is corrupt, and you can say that they believe a lie. Who says that the police are actually treating blacks and whites inequitably? In fact, if you look at the Derek Chauvin case, the prosecution hasn't even really brought up the race issue. In no way have they even sought to prove that Derek Chauvin is a racist. So the public propaganda surrounding this is completely different from the actual prosecution, which is simply a policeman is a bad apple. He got out of hand. He did things that he should not be doing in the line of duty. We never trained him to do this. Race is really not a central issue. And yet, in the public perception, it is. Let's say the January 6th protesters believe a lie. So what? Their political protest isn't invalidated. Their constitutional rights aren't chucked out because they happen to believe something that you think is false. So let's look at a simple case. Here is a mother of four. I believe her name is Victoria White. She traveled from Rochester, Minnesota to D.C. You can see her on the video. Actually, she goes into the Capitol, but you can see her on the FBI's own video. And in the FBI's own charging documents, they admit that she is arguing with other protesters, telling them, don't break the windows. And she's telling them this would be wrong, this would be unpatriotic. She's actually saying that on the video. And she's trying to pull people away from doing any kind of physical damage to the property there. Now, the sole hub of the case against her, the reason that she's facing really, I would say, the rest of her life in prison is what? That the government claims that she tried to, quote, grab an officer's shield. Now, according to Victoria White, she wasn't doing that. The shield was about to strike her, so she grabbed the shield as a form of self-protection. In other words, to keep it away from her. She wasn't trying to wrench it away from the officer or use it herself. None of that. It was one of those reflexes of self-defense to prevent herself from getting whopped with the shield. And then promptly, shortly afterward, she was struck in the head with a metal baton and she went down. So my question is, what is a just penalty for someone who does that? By the way, Victoria White is facing a series of charges, which if she was convicted on all of them, she would get 55 years in prison. 55 years in prison. Now, let's compare this with what is going on elsewhere. We have cases now in Oregon, and by the way, some of these go back to the Oregon riots of last year. And federal prosecutors, one by one, are assigning what are called these deferred resolution agreements, DRAs, so-called. And what is a deferred resolution agreement? Essentially, it is, we're agreeing to drop the charges as long as you don't do something like this again. no felony, no misdemeanor, nothing on your record at all. And this is happening time and time again. And according to a recent article in Politico, it's because of the Biden administration. The Biden administration is pressuring these prosecutors to basically cut deals with these people and let them go. Now, what are these people guilty of? Let's go through some of the things that they're doing. Striking police officers, jumping on police cars of police officers, using lasers and other forms of police interference. So, in other words, there is a close similarity between the charges in Oregon. In fact, the Oregon guys are doing worse things. We're talking about the brutalization, obstruction, assaulting police officers. And so here's Politico. Some of the assaults described in the Portland cases bear similarities to capital violence, and they give an example. One of the civil disorder defendants, Alexandra Eutin, E-U-T-I-N, used a wooden shield and hoses to strike a Portland police officer in the head while he was trying to make an arrest. Several Capitol riot suspects are accused of using riot shields to shove police or obstruct their efforts to secure the building from the mob. So we have two parallel cases, and yet they're not being treated the same. Here's something very interesting, came out just yesterday. The Department of Justice, they've closed the investigation into Ashley Babbitt, and I want to read their reason why. In order to establish a violation, they say, I'm now reading directly, prosecutors must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer, this is the black police officer who shot Babbitt in the neck, this officer acted willfully to deprive Miss Babbitt of a right protected by the Constitution or other law. Here, the Fourth Amendment right not to be subjected to an unreasonable seizure. Prosecutors would have to prove not only that the officer used force that was constitutionally unreasonable, but that the officer did so willfully, which the Supreme Court has interpreted to mean the officer acted with a bad purpose to disregard the law. As this requirement has been interpreted by the courts, evidence that an officer acted out of fear, mistake, panic, misperception, negligence, or even poor judgment cannot establish the high level of intent required. Now, let's just switch for a moment to the Dante Wright killing. Isn't it a fact that if you apply this exact same standard, which is to say, we don't care if the officer acted out of fear, which it seems that she did, mistake, that applies, panic, that applies, misperception, that applies, negligence, that applies, or even poor judgment, that applies. But according to the federal prosecutors, we can't get the guy who shot Ashley Babbitt, even if all those things were present. And yet, this woman, Kim Potter, I believe her name is charged with second-degree manslaughter for doing exactly that. Why isn't the guy, the Capitol Police officer, charged with second-degree manslaughter on exactly the same grounds? So what we have here is a breakdown of the system of equity. And justice is equity. In other words, it's not enough to say, here's a law, and if you break it, you'll get X, if everybody else gets Y. It's one thing to say, if you're speeding 90 miles an hour, you're going to get a $1,000 ticket. But then if everybody else gets off, or other people get 5 years in prison, then there's no equity under the law. Because the same or similar offense done for similar reasons doesn't carry the same penalty. Bottom line, we're seeing a troubling breakdown of the basic conception of justice in this country. And now it doesn't just affect the high and mighty, the political officials, and even political pundits. It affects people like you.